Well, and good day, everyone. This is Bruce Erickson. I'm the Agronomy e-learning manager here at Purdue University. And we would like to welcome you to our next in the series here on April 1st of webinars. We have a good show for you here today, and we'll introduce our speaker in just a moment. But let me do a little bit of housekeeping first and say a little bit about our program. Our digital agriculture program at Purdue is multi-department, multidisciplinary. We look at crop stuff, food science, livestock, forestry, soils, the whole gamut of things here. And a goal, of course, is to learn from the data, take the data that we're gathering from sensors to analyze it, and we're looking at all the various parts and pieces that go with that, featuring experts in various areas of this. And of course, in the end, we want to try to make a decision and change the management or improve the management accordingly. So we are, you can find us online. If you take a look at the website there that's listed for Digital Ag Resources, that's a good page to look up stuff related to. It's divided up by a bunch of the different topics that I just mentioned a little bit ago. We have a list of courses on there. We have events. There's a list of the various faculty of people that serve, and lots of good stuff there. If you're specifically interested in UAVs or drones, there's another excellent site there that you can see the web address. And we're affiliated with the Wabash Heartland Innovation Network, and they support our programs here to a great extent, and that's at win.org. And if you haven't looked into them, their website, that's an interesting thing to learn about digital agriculture from. So today, here we are, just to show you that, today we're going to be looking at the value of data. A week from now, we're going to look at weed management, just to show you where we're going here. The following week, livestock, next UAVs, and you can see all the way there. On the 6th of May, Nicole Widmer, Dr. Widmer, will talk about public data for helping us make some decisions about things. And then John Evans on the 13th of May, okay? So if you happen to miss some of those that we did earlier this spring or winter or last fall, those are also archived on the Digital Ag website, that first website that I showed you on the previous slide. Okay, so as we get going here today, I guess I'm the moderator, and I'll turn it over to the speaker in just a moment. But if you have a question, it's good to use the chat room feature, at least, and I may interrupt the speaker a time or two if I have something pressing, or if you put a question in the queue, we can ask your question. At the end, though, what we can do is open it up, and you can ask your question verbally if you want. Leave your cameras off, that would probably be good, and make sure your microphone is muted, okay? So anyway, at this point in time, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker of today, Nate DeLay. And Nate's been at Purdue for 3 or 4 years, and it's been my pleasure to get to know Nate the last few years here. And if you want to take over the screen, Nate, you can go ahead and do that now. He comes to us from, got a couple of degrees, one from the University of, 3 degrees actually, from Colorado. And then his PhD is in economics from Washington State University. And so he works with a host of things related to economics in terms of does a digital agriculture practice pay? But one of the things we're always very curious about is the value of data. Because, like a tractor, you can see, well, that is something I can see and touch, whatever, quarter section of land. But data is something that's a little bit different, and that's a little different thinking of putting a value on that. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing what Nate has to say. So please give Nate your attention, and we'll hit him with some questions here in just a little bit. Go ahead, Nate.
Okay, hey, thanks a lot, Bruce, for that warm introduction. And thanks to Dennis and Randy for organizing this. I've been tuning into these sessions on Thursdays, and I've really enjoyed it a lot. So I'm looking forward to the ones coming up. And I hope today is going to be an enlightening discussion around issues of farm data valuation and how to think about farm data as a store of value, as an asset. So just to put this kind of in context, we all know investment in ag tech continues to grow, and much of that investment is occurring in what are called upstream startups. So these are firms that are operating close to the farm gate in terms of farm management softwares, robotics, equipment, things like that, things that enhance the productivity of farmland. And in fact, even though there was the pandemic going on, 2020 actually set a record for investment in ag tech. So Ag Funder News reported about $30 billion estimated funding raised in 2020 for ag tech, and over half of that was in upstream startups. So again, firms working with farmers. And that actually hasn't happened since about 2013. Most of the investment has been taking place downstream of the farm, but 2020 was kind of a reversal for that. And so given all this investment, there's naturally a growth in the amount of data that can be collected on farms. So we've got remote sensing technologies, informing precision application, farm data softwares, all these things continue to advance, and that just means more data is going to be stored in the cloud. And so the question is then, what do you do with that data and how can we derive value from it? But despite this growth in data collection capacity, few can really estimate the value of data with much certainty. And I'll tell you right from the get-go here, I don't have the answer to this question of what is farm data worth, but I'm hoping to provide in this presentation and in the discussion that follows kind of a framework for how you would approach that question. How do we think about data as an asset that would allow us to estimate its value? So again, not a lot of clarity around the value, and that's true both of researchers and farmers, by the way. So the graph I'm showing here was sort of an informal poll that we did at the last Top Farmer Conference. So the Center for Commercial Agriculture, which is housed here in the Department of Ag Econ, does a conference every January called the Top Farmer Conference. And of course, we couldn't do that live in 2020, but in 2019, we asked the attendees a series of questions related to how they value their own data. And the first one was, what is the minimum amount of money you would be willing to accept to give up complete ownership of your yield monitor data for last year's harvest? And we asked this in terms of dollars per acre of data, and we gave them bins. And I don't know if that's clear, but the top is less than $1 per acre. And then the bottom is the most expensive, $100 or more per acre. And then the largest bar there is the $10 to $20 range. And what you can see is, maybe with the exception of that 10 to 20 bin, there's not really a clear answer that emerges from this question. Farmers didn't really coalesce around a mean that would be useful. There's just as many farms that would say it's worth less than $1 per acre to me as there are that think it's worth over $100 an acre, right? So there's just not a lot of clarity around what is the worth of this data that people are collecting. We asked the same question about soil sample data. Here, the dollars per acre estimate was a little more concentrated in that $10 range, which kind of makes sense given the cost of doing soil sampling is about $10 an acre. So there's a little bit more clarity around what is soil data worth. And then we asked, finally, what would we have to pay you to sell us your drone or satellite imagery data? And that was a little more variable than the soil sample side. But again, just not much of a clear answer that we were getting from these survey participants.
And Nate, excuse me, I'm going to jump in here. There's a good question in the queue from Cheryl. She's asking, can the farmer still use the data on these last 3 slides? How did you set that up?
So we prompted them with, we are taking complete ownership of it. That means you have to transfer it to us and you don't have access to it anymore.
Okay.
That's how we primed this question. And
Very good.
That's a great question because that will have a huge influence over farmers' valuation of the data, right?
Yeah, excellent.
So before I go any further, I just want to kind of set the stage about what farm data is and its major characteristics. And so I'm going to adopt a definition used in the literature which says farm data is geospatial data and metadata on production, machinery, and environmental factors. So generally speaking, this is stuff that's happening on the farm and about the farm. Okay, so within that context, let's look at some of the major characteristics of farm data. And the first is that it's intangible, right? You can't hold farm data in your hand. It's not like a physical asset in that sense. So it's intangible. It's also irreplaceable. So if you're dutifully collecting yield monitor data and you keep it recorded somewhere like on a zip drive or on your hard drive or something, and that crashes and you lose it, you can't get it back, right? It's irreplaceable. So that will naturally influence how we think about it in terms of its worth. It's also what's called non-rival, which means that if I have access to your farm data, that doesn't diminish your access to your farm data, right? Like a rivalrous good would be, say, an apple. And if I'm eating the apple, then you can't eat that same apple. Data is not really that way, right? If I have a copy of your Microsoft Excel file, it doesn't limit your ability to use your Excel file, right? So there's a non-rival component. And then the excludability factor. I put a question mark next to excludable because it kind of depends. So excludability means I have some ability to exclude you from accessing my farm data. And the reason I put the question mark there is because depending on your particular data sharing agreement with an ag tech company or the way you store your data, there will be varying degrees of excludability. So if I collect data, but I don't use any sort of cloud-based software platform, I basically just store it on my own hard drive and don't share it with anybody. I have the ability to exclude people from accessing that. So in that sense, it would be excludable. But if I was to upload that data to, Op Center or Climate Field View or something like that, depending on the data sharing agreement or the data use agreement that I have with that cloud-based program, it could be excludable or not. So the ag tech company could have the right to sell that data or to share it with other platforms, for that reason. And if you agree to allow them to do that, then you have lost your ability to exclude others from accessing the data. So in economics, we think about these two poles in terms of the types of goods. There's private goods on one end, and that's goods that are both rivalrous and excludable. So that's the apple in that example I used before. You can prevent people from having it. If I consume it, you can't consume it. So it's got complete and total ownership vested in the person that has it. On the opposite end of the spectrum are what are called public goods. And I think Dr. Nicole Widmar is going to talk a little bit about this in a couple of weeks. Public goods are where you have a non-rival aspect and a non-excludable aspect. So that the best example of that would be like national defense. The moment that a government sets up an army to protect a country, you can't prevent somebody else from enjoying that protection, and you can't exclude people from the ability to be protected. So somewhere in between that is where farm data lies, and it's what's called a club good. Now, it's not a perfect definition or a perfect characterization of farm data, but it's the closest that we have, and that's a good that you can upload into, say, a data community, and you can prevent people outside the data community from accessing that data. But once it's in there, the people that are a member of that data community, they can access it. So there's this non-rival component where people within the data community aren't prevented from using the data, but you can prevent people that are outside of that. And so farm data enjoys some of the protections afforded to trade secrets. So when you think about the legal ownership of an asset, it could be something like this, could be a patent, it could be a copyright, or it could be a trade secret. And neither patents nor copyrights really do a good job of explaining farm data. Patents deal with inventions, copyrights, works of art, and things like that. But trade secrets are more like, patterns or methods, some way of doing something where the value is generated by preventing other people from having that particular method. So this all kind of tees up the way to think about the sources of farm data. And generally speaking, the literature has identified two sources of data sources of value that you could get from farm data. The first is the management value of data. And this is probably what we think of first when we think of farm data as having value. So it enhances the decision-making of the farmer and it improves the productivity and the profitability of the farmland. That's value that's contained within the farm gate. So it's not value that extends beyond, but it's on the farm. And then the second source of value would be what's called aggregation value. And that's when you pool data with lots of other sources of farm data, say from similar agroclimatic zones or something like that. And then having that big data aggregated together allows other farmers to make better decisions about their input application based on the large amount of experiences from these other farmers. It could also provide value to agribusiness in the form of market intelligence, how farmers behave, what's their buying patterns, that kind of thing, what are their characteristics, and also equipment performance. In the 90s, we had this thing called OnStar that came out, and everybody thought it was great. What we didn't know was that OnStar was really a big data collection firm, and they were able to get a ton of data on the way people drive that was really valuable to the automotive industry. The same is true with farm equipment. These tractors, these applicators, they collect a ton of data, and that helps inform the manufacturer about performance that allows them to make better products and to understand their customers better. So these are all sources of data that flow downstream of the farm, that are off of the farm. So I'm going to start with that first one, the management value of farm data. And I'm going to talk about a research paper that I've done with colleagues in the Center for Commercial Agriculture, Dr. Jim Minert, the director of the center, and Nathan Thompson, who's an assistant professor in Ag Econ. And we wanted to understand more of the efficiency value generated by using farm data and using precision agriculture together. So when you think about precision agriculture, it sort of advertises itself as increasing the productivity of the farm by applying inputs on a site-specific basis. Now, and farm data can enhance those application decisions, but it has to first be collected and analyzed and used in an effective way. So the benefits of precision agriculture and of data usage have been found to be cumulative. So there's no one technology that's going to be sort of the silver bullet and dramatically increase the profitability of a farm. Instead, these things should be thought of in terms of systems and layering different technologies together such that the benefits are going to be cumulative. So given that, we wanted to look at how farms bundle these different technologies, both precision ag and data intensive technologies. How do they bundle those together? And can we identify groups of farms based on their different adoption patterns? So what we did is we used USDA data from what's called the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, the ARMS survey, which is field level and farm level survey, very in-depth, done by about 1,500 farms every year. And we looked at the 2016 corn survey, and that particular survey had a lot of great questions about precision ag adoption and usage of certain data type technologies. So everything from yield monitors to GPS guidance to drones to whether the farm analyzed their data on a computer or used a mobile app to analyze their data or used some ag tech company like Climate Field View. And what we did is we used something called cluster analysis, which is a way to group different observations according to some set of criteria. So we grouped these farms based on their adoption of these different technologies. And we identified 4 very distinct groups. And these groups, they map pretty neatly onto what's called the technology adoption curve, or sometimes called the diffusion of innovation model. And that model says that if you have a new technology that's introduced, it's going to be adopted first by really progressive type people. And these are called the innovators or the early adopters. They're going to be the first to adopt, followed by the early majority group, which are maybe not on the bleeding edge, but shortly thereafter. The late majority group comes after them, and then the laggards is the last to adopt, if they adopt at all. And we found that if you look at the way these groups adopt technologies, some pretty striking things emerge. The first is that laggards don't use any of these technologies. You know, they don't even have a yield monitor, and they're certainly not collecting and analyzing farm data. Naturally, those are farms that are very small. So the average farm size there of 278 acres, it's a little bit misleading because that's the number of corn acres that they planted in 2016. So it's not the total land holdings of those farms, it's just the number of corn acres they planted. That is going to correspond pretty closely to how much total land they have. But just for comparison, you go all the way to the innovators and they're significantly bigger, almost 1,500 acres of planted corn. The average age of those farms follows a pretty predictable pattern. Younger farms tend to be in that innovators group, and the educational attainment of these farms is also pretty striking. 41% of the laggards have a college degree versus 69 and 66% of these early majority and innovator farms. So we looked at how these farms are adopting technologies. We looked at their yield monitor usage and then some of the more advanced technologies. We looked at the late majority group and we called them passive adopters because they pretty much have a yield monitor and not much else. 68% of them use a yield monitor, but they're not using farm data very, very much at all. Early majority take that yield monitor and they do the extra step of producing yield maps with GPS. And then they have much higher rates of GPS guidance, and they're pretty likely to use a computer to analyze their data. But it's the innovators, which are the really progressive farms, that are using a lot of these technologies pretty heavily, almost all of whom are doing soil sampling and variable rate technology, almost all analyze data on the computer, and almost 70% will share their farm data with some sort of service provider. So those farmers we call the information seekers. They're really out to get more data and use more data. So having identified these groups, we want to look at what percentage of the farm populations they represent and what percent of the acreage or production that they represent. And using sampling weights provided by USDA, we see that laggards and late majority, you know, sort of the ones kind of bringing up the caboose on this technology stuff, they're about 2/3 of all corn farms, but they are responsible for only half of the acreage or half of the production in the US. You look at the innovators, they're only 13% of farms, but they represent almost 1/4 of all the acreage of all the corn produced. So clearly there's some scale implications here, and you saw that when we looked at the average farm size between these groups. So we went and after having identified these groups, we looked at differences in what's called technical efficiency. I won't get into too much of the details about what that is, but basically technical efficiency measures the degree to which a farm achieves its maximum feasible production level. So it's just a measure, it's between 0 and 1. If you're at a 1, that means you're achieving your production potential. You're getting as much out of your inputs as you possibly can. And if you fall below that number, if you're below 1, close to 0, you're inefficient, meaning you're not achieving your maximum feasible production. So we estimate this using a technique called stochastic frontier analysis. And then we get these distributions of technical efficiency. Okay, so again, you want to be closer to 1 and you don't want to be close to 0. And we found that the laggards group was the least technically efficient, which is another way of saying they're the most inefficient. and the innovators are the most technically efficient or the least inefficient. But the interesting thing is the difference, the biggest jump occurs between this late majority group, sort of the passive adopters of technology, and the data users, so the ones that actually use that farm data to produce maps. The marginal increase for the innovators group is actually quite small. So some pretty interesting implications there for the value of farm data. All right, so farms that collect and use data intensively are more efficient. We're not saying that if any farm just starts doing these things and using data that they will naturally sort of causally become more efficient. We've just identified some interesting differences across these groups that could inform benchmarking and that kind of stuff. And that improved efficiency could translate into greater profitability, right? So that would be really the value of this farm data. You know, its ability to increase productivity, efficiency, and profitability. We don't know much about the cost associated with these farms and the cost of acquiring data, using data. It may be the case that for the farms that are able to do that successfully, the marginal profitability is there, but not true of everybody else. Last thing I'll say on the management side before I move on to aggregation value. It's not that farms, you know, looking at that passive adopters group, it's not that they're not getting any value from using yield monitors. For example, about 80% of farms in this survey that have a yield monitor will use that data to inform grain drying decisions. So that's, you know, just looking at the moisture content of the grain and then informing whether or not they need to dry before selling or whatever. So there's different ways that you can derive management value. We were just looking specifically at the precision ag sort of context of it. Okay, so the aggregation value of farm data, there's multiple ways that this can go. But to start, farm data, like a lot of data, benefits from what are called network externalities. So this is a term in economics where the more you contribute to some community or some pool or network, the greater the value that network is. So the classic example is the telephone. If I'm the only person in the world with a telephone, the telephone technology is pretty meaningless. And as the more people get a telephone, the more valuable that network becomes, right? So the same is true of farm data. If you have only one farm contributing to some data community, you're not going to be able to gain a lot of insights about farms in general from that single data point. So the more you contribute to it, the more valuable it becomes. And Farmers Business Network has demonstrated this to be true in the agricultural context by basically crowdsourcing data from farmers and then allowing farmers to benefit from that network by gaining insights about input costs and performance and things like that. You could also generate value by informing commodity trading decisions. So I've got a picture here of Trading Places, you know, the classic Dan Aykroyd, Eddie Murphy movie. The plot in that movie is these bad guys are going to they're going to intercept information about the frozen juice concentrate market before USDA releases official estimates. They're going to use that insider information to basically corner the market on frozen orange juice. So there's no law that explicitly bans companies from taking, you know, remote sense data or data from some farm data network and using that in commodity futures trading decisions. You obviously can't do that when it comes to public data, something like the WASI report or, you know, the planting report that USDA does. But these private networks, there's not really a law against using that. So there could be some value there, and we might see that emerge or become more common in the future. So this could really benefit farmers if the demand for farm data continues to rise. And there's actually a company called Farm Mobile that's doing this. They're allowing farmers to upload whatever data that they want to this network that they call the data store, and then buyers of farm data can peruse that and they can make cash offers for farm data. The farmer then can accept or reject that offer. They have complete control over what they actually end up transferring. But it really is becoming this farm data market. I couldn't tell you, to what extent this data store has developed, or how many acres they have, or how many farmers are participating. But it's kind of a proof of concept that, yeah, there is a lot of demand, or at least some demand, for this kind of farm data. And if the price is right, farmers would be willing to contribute. Aggregation value could also manifest itself in terms of demonstrating sustainable practices. This is certainly related to distributed ledger technology like blockchain, used to trace grain and meat provenance throughout the supply chain. Farms that collect a lot of data and have good quality data are able to demonstrate their good practices. That's also something that could emerge as really important when we talk about carbon markets and paying farmers to do things that sequester carbon. Obviously, you're going to need to demonstrate that the effect you've had. So farm data is one way of doing that. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about, I'm kind of going to move on from the management value versus aggregation value. And I'm going to talk about a specific research project that I'm working on with our MC, Bruce Erickson, as well as some other folks in Ag Econ, Jason Lusk, Nathan Thompson, Jim Minter, Todd Keithy, and we're working on something that we were fortunate enough to get an Ag Seed grant to fund this project. We want to know if farmers would be willing to pay to acquire farm data in farmland markets. So the idea here is that farm data could address information asymmetries in farmland markets where, the owner of farmland knows more about the productive characteristics of the land than the tenant, or the tenant knows more than the absentee landlord or something like that. We want to know if farm data could alleviate some of these farmland markets and become potentially a regular part of transactions in farmland transactions. As of right now, that's not at all common or expected, but it may be so in the future. So the idea here is if you have a field that you're renting and you were willing to transfer to the new tenant all of the historical farm data, then maybe a tenant would be willing to pay more because they could use that historical data to make better management decisions immediately, right on day one when they acquired the land. So the formal research question is, are farmers willing to pay a premium to rent farmland that comes with historical precision ag farm data? And we've got an example of our, this is a draft of the survey that we're going to do. We're basically giving farmers what's called a choice experiment. We're going to present them with a number of different fields, and these are supposed to approximate a farmland auction flyer. We're going to give them some details about the field, and then one of those details is whether or not the field comes with historical farm data, either historical soil data or yield monitor data. And in presenting to the survey participants these fields in just the right way, we can estimate this willingness to pay to acquire that kind of data. So some hypotheses that derive from this: one, if there's a positive willingness to pay, then that will indicate or be a measure of the management value of farm data, because farmers will be able to use that data immediately upon acquiring the land, and they can use it to inform their management decisions. We also are going to vary the soil map that's shown on the flyer. You can see on the left here on the top is a highly variable soil map, and on the bottom is a relatively uniform soil map. And we want to test whether in the presence of high soil variability, would this willingness to pay to acquire data be higher than when you're just looking at a uniform type field that would probably justify uniform application. So early in 2020, before things went really crazy, we were able to do some initial testing of this survey. It wasn't the exact version that I showed you on the last slide, but it was kind of a crude draft of it. And these numbers here with the stars next to them basically represent the additional amount that farmers were willing to bid for fields that had those characteristics. So tile drainage, 2484, means farmers would pay about $25 more per acre if the field is tile drained, right? And that's the biggest factor of the ones that we looked at, and that makes sense. That's a hugely important feature. If the field came with historical soil data, farmers were willing to pay about $10 more, and that's pretty much in line with how much it costs to do soil sampling. And then we gave them two other options around yield monitor data. If the field has 1 year's worth of yield monitor data, they were willing to pay about $4 more per acre. And if it came with 5 years worth of yield monitor data, they were willing to pay about $7.78 more per acre. So again, these are certainly initial results, but it does point to and suggest a positive willingness to pay for this kind of data. So to summarize those results, yes, farmers appear to be willing to pay some premium for farm land that comes with precision data. It's about $10 for soil data and $4 and $8 for yield monitor data for 1 and 5 years respectively. That works out to be about 2% increase in the bid for 1 year's worth and about 4% increase for 5 years. So it's not a huge bump, but it does imply that there's value to be had there both for farmland owners and potential tenants. So we're going to do a much more formal version of this this summer, thanks to an Ag Seed grant from the college. And we're also looking to do another survey where we present farmers with something more like that very first example I showed, where we're an ag tech company and we're coming to the farmer to buy the data that they do have. So we're going to set up a different kind of choice experiment where we vary the contract type, whether or not the farmer gets to keep the data or if they have to transfer it completely to us, some of the privacy implications, and then how much from this we're going to estimate how much farmers would be willing to accept to give up the data that they have. And doing those two surveys, it will be interesting to see the difference between what farmers would pay to come to acquire data that they don't have and what you would have to pay them to give up data that they already have. Okay. So looking at the barriers to deriving value from farm data, I've identified three. There's certainly much more that you could talk about, but the three main barriers that I've encountered are economies of scale with farm data, cost and usability, and privacy concerns. So the first one, economies of scale, just means that as you get bigger, the per unit costs of something falls. So it naturally advantages larger operations. And farm data could certainly be benefit from scale economies. And that's because even though if you have some sort of ag data software and you might pay on the per acre basis, you still have the upfront cost of learning the data, collecting the data that's going to be transferred to the software. There's an adjustment cost component to that. And I'm showing here, these are statistics again from that USDA ARM survey. So this is corn farms. It's a nationally representative survey sample. And I'm looking at adoption of ag tech software. So think Climate Field View or Granular or something like that. Farms that use computers to analyze data and farms that use mobile devices to analyze data. And you can see that there's a very obvious and predictable pattern with larger farms, larger operations are much more likely to do these kinds of data intensive practices. And there's some interesting differences in that. For example, if you look at computers and mobile devices, once you get beyond 1,000 acres, there's not a big change after that in adoption rates. So the yellow and the green are computer and mobile devices, respectively. Ag tech software, which is much less common as a rule, but that increases pretty sharply at the 2,000 plus acre mark. So it implies that not only are there scale economy implications here where large farms will, it's more cost effective for large farms to do these kinds of things, potentially, but also there's differences in the types of data analysis tools and the scale economies implied with them. In terms of cost and usability of farm data, we did a survey in 2019 around farmers' collection, use, and decision-making from farm data. And we asked first, do you collect different kinds of farm data? And those that didn't collect any farm data, we followed them up with a question of, well, what's the primary reason you're not collecting farm data? What's the biggest barrier to doing that? And it was kind of evenly split between too costly and uncertain with how to use the data. So together that would, you could call that like a value proposition problem. But then when we looked at software adoption, so again, whether or not you adopted granular or Conservice or something like that. And if they didn't, we asked them what was the primary reason for not using these software tools. Now there, the uncertainty with the software was by and large the most common response. So, depending on the data type or the data analysis tool, there's some hesitancy to use these products because they're just uncertain of how to use it. How do we implement this into our existing farm operation? How much time is it going to get to integrate this? Does it work with all of our equipment? All of those kinds of concerns can be major roadblocks.
And Nate, excuse me, I'm going to interrupt here again because there's a question in the queue related to exactly this. There's a few others that we'll get to at the end that are more general questions, but the question from Michael is, was this data that you're showing now, was that a Purdue survey, and asks if it was the survey on barriers to farm data value?
So this was part of a survey that we did at Purdue. I can share the link to the report on the survey.
Okay.
Maybe in the chat or something like that.
Yeah.
We did it was a phone survey. It was in August 2019. And, some basic questions around what data do you collect? To what degree do you use that data in making decisions? And looking back on those data-driven decisions, do you think they were yield improving or not?
Yeah, this is some excellent data. I don't think I've seen this before. I'm also very happy to see the privacy concerns are a fairly small piece of that pie. I would have thought that they would have been bigger. Privacy would be bigger. Yeah,
that was surprising to us too. And other surveys have found that to be a much bigger concern. And I think because of the way we asked it, we said, what's the number one, if you had to pick one of these barriers, what's the number one reason you didn't adopt this technology?
Okay.
So if we had gave them the option to rank them, it probably would have been.
Might have been a little bigger, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. So this usability issue has other implications. There was a Wall Street Journal article that just came out last week, and the title is, "It Shouldn't Cost the Farm to Fix a Tractor." And it's an opinion piece, but I think the author captures the sentiment of a lot of farmers here when he's talking about this newer equipment that's got a lot of software and requires special fixes when it breaks down is putting some farmers off, and it's actually driving them towards older equipment. So the quote here says, some farmers are choosing to forego newer equipment altogether, instead opting for 30 or 40-year-old tractors they can keep running on their own. As a result, older machines are fetching high prices at auction. And it goes on to report some pretty striking statistics. But this really captures that usability issue. When farmers can't fix something themselves and they can't go to their local repair person and they have to go through a dealership, that at harvest they could be waiting for days to get their stuff fixed. It's going to drive people away potentially. So I think there's some really interesting research questions that could come out of this one article. And finally, on the privacy side, you may remember a case involving a company called Tillable, which in late 2019, early 2020, was the center of a real controversy on social media because farmers were getting offer letters from this company called Tillable. Landowners were getting letters from Tillable saying that they would rent the land for oftentimes a higher rate than their current tenants were paying. And this got out on social media and farmers were really upset about it. And the controversy developed to where a narrative formed that climate field view data that farmers had uploaded to FieldView was being shared with Tillable through an API that Tillable was then using to inform these offer letters to go and try to assume farmland from landowners. Now, Tillable has maintained the whole time that they never established a data connection with FieldView. They never transferred any data from FieldView to Tillable, but at that point, the damage had been done. The narrative had sort of formed, and FieldView ends up terminating their relationship with Tillable. And I think Tillable tried to sort of issue some kind of a mea culpa and reintroduce themselves with the farming community, and I don't know how well it went over, but it's a story that really kind of cuts to the core of this privacy issue, because when you're talking about data and you're talking about farmers' relationship with landowners, there's you really have to be, you have to value farmers' trust, and you have to be careful with that. A few years ago, American Farm Bureau did a survey that was pretty striking. This is probably 5 or 6 years ago now, but I'd be interested to see how these numbers have changed. But at that time anyway, 80% of farmers were concerned or extremely concerned about who had access to their data. And only a little over half didn't know if they themselves owned or controlled their data. So clearly it's a case of you're using a product and you're agreeing to terms of service that is enormous and you have no hope of ever reading, in the same way that we do with whenever we have an Apple iPhone update. So there was, at that time at least, and I'm assuming it's continued, just a lot of uncertainty around data ownership. An organization called Trust in Food and the Sustainability Consortium did their own survey. This was more recent. I think this came out last year, where they asked farmers, again, some of the major deterrents to sharing farm data. So here they said, just rank these different issues by whether it's a major reason, a minor reason, or not a reason at all for not sharing your farm data. Regulation came up as their number one there. So it says, I feel that farm data will be used to enact more stringent government regulations. That was the one that had the most people saying it was a major concern. So I think last week it was brought up by the presenter, and I apologize, I don't remember who it was, made the comment that farmers are really hesitant to share data because out of fear that it'll be used against them. And this survey result really touches on that. Privacy was pretty high. It says, I am afraid that by sharing data, I might make myself a target of malicious activity. So a similar kind of concern there. 36% said that was a major concern, and 46% said that was at least a minor concern. So we want to look for ways to incentivize data sharing in a safe way that benefits both farmers and people that can use farm data to improve on-farm practices and policymaking. But we have to do that while protecting privacy and addressing these concerns. So groups like Ag Data Transparent is doing just that. They've got a really good certification program where ag data companies can go through it and commit to, putting farmers in the driver's seat when it comes to their data and protecting their privacy. And the Ag Data Coalition is working to strengthen privacy protection for farm data as well and encourage the kind of data sharing that we as researchers would like to see. So with that, I think I've got some time to do questions. So thanks, everybody.
We do have Nate. Thank you very much. That's some stuff that I hadn't seen before, and this is a topic that's of really acute interest for me, and I'm sure the participants in our webinar too. But we have several questions. There's some comments in the queue also, and I'm going to get to those in our remaining 10 minutes or so. But just as a follow-up to your last point there, how well are we doing in agriculture? I guess I get the sense from what I read online is that maybe in ag we're lagging some in terms of digital ag, and it's maybe our concerns about privacy and our concerns about sharing and those types of things that that are holding us back. Any sense from you on how we're doing overall? More from the second half of your presentation in terms of the sharing and aggregating stuff.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's an important one. I don't have a good sense of how agriculture compares to other sectors in terms of protecting privacy and ensuring, incentivizing sharing and that kind of thing. My sense is that, when we looked at that USDA data and we looked at the kind of farms that are collecting a lot of data and sharing data, these are really the farms that will continue to consolidate and grow larger into the future. And so there's a sense that, the really data intensive farms are the ones that are going to be around for a long time. So they're more accustomed already to data sharing. And I think that when it comes to how to get some of the smaller farms to get value out of their data, ag tech companies need to do a little better job with the privacy protections and just the general sense that they're in the interest of the farmer. And that's why Ag Data Transparent and these other groups are so important.
So here's just a comment from Dennis Buckmaster, who, if you're missing Dennis as the moderator, he will be back sometime in the future. You're not going to be stuck with me forever here. You probably miss his jokes. So Dennis says, it would be interesting to compare this farmer perception of value and their, fake bidding or whatever, to things like fertilizer savings or anticipated yield differences too, which I think you've done some of that work, haven't you, Nate? Gotten a sense of what they think the value is for. I know I've seen some of that information. What does a farmer think the value of VRT is compared to a flat rate across fertilizer across the whole field? Do you have any recent results on that?
We've looked at part of that survey we did in 2019 was primarily focused on how data informs farm decision making. And so we asked these farmers, do you collect different types of data? And then we asked them to what extent they use that data to inform their decisions. We asked about fertilizer, nutrient management decisions. We asked about seeding decisions, and we asked about drainage investment decisions. And the nutrient side was the most, by a pretty good margin, was the most data influenced farm decision that we found. And that makes a lot of sense because, when it comes to VRT fertilizer, that's been around longer than VRT seeding. It's more of an established practice, even though it's not hugely common. But it's kind of natural for farm data to inform fertilizer decisions where, variable rate seeding is a little bit of a newer practice.
Yeah, and we found the same thing in our crop life survey. And incidentally, we just completed we've got 400 and some responses on that for 2021, and we'll be coming out with that data here soon. And the nutrient decisions in that also some with planting rates too, but nutrients have been the most, the thing of data that the dealers say that they provides the most value on farms. So let me and maybe you can see these too, Nate, some of the questions, but let me ask a few more of them here. Back on that that very first information, the red bars in some of your first slides. Brianna is asking, were the respondents also given the option to indicate whether they would not give up complete ownership? Where she's really getting into the heart of your survey methodology, Nate.
Yeah. So this was a pretty informal kind of thing, and it was just to get a sense of a very broad sense of how farmers think about data. But we did not give them the option to say, "I just wouldn't sell it."
Yeah. Okay.
That will come into that $100 or more range.
Yeah.
Now I will say this: when we did those initial surveys in the spring of 2020 on the Farmland survey, we also included questions like the willingness to accept at the end of that survey, and we only got, I don't know, maybe a fifth of the respondents to even answer that question. You know, it was basically the same question: what would we have to pay you to give up ownership of your data? And if they didn't answer, that to me says it's not for sale. So I would say roughly 75% maybe said it's not for sale.
Yeah, and if you haven't conducted a survey, I know you do a lot of this, Nate, but it's really surprising. Some people, you know, don't even answer certain questions. I'm always surprised how wacky some of that stuff is on some of my survey work. Here's a really interesting question too from Michael, and he's referring back to where you had the adoption data on the late majority, the innovators, laggards, etc. And he's asking, what about the impacts on the ability to manage farms that are widely separated geographically, say in other countries and other states, and therefore the advantage in tech adoption, knowledge, risk, dispersion, he's asking, is there a correlation between innovators and those people that have farms that are spread out geographically? I mean,
yeah, that's a great question.
A really interesting question.
It is.
It makes sense to me that it would be.
Yeah, it would to me, but we don't have that that data in the survey.
Yeah. Okay. And let me see here. There's a few new ones coming in. And I haven't read this yet. It just came in. I'm just going to read it. Fresh and raw. So Cameron says, it's interesting to see that there appears to be a diminishing marginal return for data, at least for yield monitor data, going from 4 an acre 1 year data to 8 for 5 years of data. And Nate, do you see this trend with other types of farm data as you're adding more years? And could this information help us understand how much data we need for decision making?
Yeah, great point, Cameron. That sort of diminishing marginal change there emerges in the other paper that I talked about too, when we looked at farms that were really advanced versus farms that were pretty advanced, right? The big change occurred when farms just used the yield monitor data to make a map at all. And in the same story here, it's like that first year of yield monitor data is doing most of the work.
Right.
Thing on top of that is less valuable. I think that sort of speaks to the value question in general, that, you know, having anything is really important and having incrementally more might not be as important.
So I think we have time for one more. We're almost at 1:30 here, but this is from Andrew here at Purdue on our team. And he makes a really interesting point, says he's wondering how those of us on the tech side of the equation, like the real basic sensor developers and communication developers, can use this type of work to drive at better answers to questions as to what to collect and how to use it. I guess I think he's asking, how can we better start with the end in mind? You're working more with after all the data gets in hand and how we're going to use it. He's more at the beginning of the data stream And what about the, yes, he's, it's a theoretical question, a sort of thought experiment driven design loop that avoids churn at the early stages, like maybe some kind of a market value model. Any, uh, I don't know how I'd answer that, Nate, but I'm going to let you take a stab at it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, let's say you're starting from a baseline and you don't have anything. What's the first and most important sort of data stream to start collecting? I think from seeing just having yield monitor data that you use to make a GPS map seems to be pretty valuable. And again, I think that's like these big discrete changes that do most of the legwork, whereas incremental changes are a little hard to measure, the effects on profitability. So I'm probably not doing a very good job of answering your question, Andrew, but I think sort of those classic precision ag technologies that give a lot of insight without, involving a huge amount of cost, like just taking your yield monitor data and making some good maps. I think that goes a long way. Like we've seen, really, really advanced farms do seem to increase their efficiency, but the marginal change might not be worth the cost for everybody.
Okay,
Hey,
well,
this is Andrew.
Yeah, Andrew's, go ahead, Andrew.
I guess I think you're kind of getting at the answer to my question, and by getting that insight, like incremental data may not be as valuable. I guess I'm wondering, do you see any opportunity to say maybe take that big farmer who is using some of this data already to build models that will help us understand how impactful maybe a new idea might be at the smaller scale, in the areas of the market that aren't adopting these technologies right now anyways. But yet we can say, well, we can show provable value at that bigger guy that has data sets available to learn from, and that it's going to help the lower ones. It'll help us encourage adoption.
Yeah, I think it's a great tool for benchmarking, and here's the example of farms that are really doing this well. I would be a little bit cautious of sort of applying that model to farms that are at the other end of the spectrum, because these tools really work together as a system in a systems approach. And a big farm that's got a lot of tools that have been integrated over time, adding another product, say one more specialized software product, is different when you have that foundation laid than a farm that's just starting out.
So Nate, we have a couple more comments in the queue that I'll just read. Whoops, my queue just went away there. Someone changed it here. So my chat, let me open that. Here we go. So from Juan, just a comment more than a question. And then we're going to up here. My experience collecting yield data has been that the quality is subpar. Many farmers don't calibrate their monitors and they don't enter hybrid and variety names properly. And so he's emphasizing the aspect of data and then data quality, I mean. And then a great comment from Alan. He says, Nate, you recognize data for management decisions and aggregate data. What about the value stream, the value data for market access? And any thought about that? And then I'll close it off.
So, Alan, it sounds like you're talking about.
And this is Alan Gray. You know this, Alan.
So the idea is that you can. So, Alan, maybe you can chime in. What do you mean by better market access?
Yeah, so Nate, think about companies that want to pay for data associated with carbon sequestration or water quality running off the side of the field, or in the animal side, animal health or animal treatment, things like that, where that data has a different level of value. It's not about productivity on the farm. It's really more about market access potentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely going to be an important source of value for data in the future. It could be, like we've talked about before, where it's a required sort of just for access as like table stakes is what we say. You have to provide a certain amount of data that demonstrates a certain amount of things that you've done in order to sell your product. Or it could be you're able to differentiate your product in a way that sort of decommoditizes it and makes it different and unique in some way. And I think that that's going to be very important in the future.
So yeah, that's an increasing part of precision ag, digital agriculture as we've gone along, is the value of that up and down the value chain. So we're going to need to close it off today, but Nate, I really thank you for the insights that you've provided today. We'll be back again next week with some information on digital weed control with Dharmendra Saraswat. And so take a look at the past webinars. There's the website if you haven't seen those yet. And again, thanks everyone. And we'll see you all here again next week.